remarkable director of UC San Diego's Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. Winner of our national competition, UCSD opened the center on May 20, 2013. I had a timeline in my head that day. Under Professor Brown's leadership, they were at least 2 years ahead of that shallow dream. Better yet, the university took the unusual step of making the center a mission of almost all the colleges and departments on the campus. Perhaps lately you've overheard the phrase, the military designation, joint base. Joint base this, joint base that. Well, in the UCSD's world, you could recognize that our long-held dream is now Joint Base Clarke. The man who leads that base now holds the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Endowed Chair in Digital Media and Learning. He's also UCSD Site Director of the National Science Foundation-sponsored Center for Hybrid Multi-Core Productivity Research. Pretty cutting-edge stuff, right? Of course, and yet it was Sheldon Brown who perked right up and responded to the simple idea that one's rich human imagination may indeed find its beginning at the moment when that baby in the bassinet, mind hardly formed, reaches out to touch what turns out to be a little bell and wonders, what if? Ladies and gentlemen, meet Sheldon Brown.
Well, thank you, Tedson. That was a wonderful introduction, and look forward to actually getting you to do something now. You don't have the excuse of running the foundation. Now I can actually get you to work. So, but Tedson's been the great inspiration to how we shape the center, and I'm going to give you an update on things that we've been doing over the last year. So this is, the third chapter of the story of the Clarke Center for Human Imagination. If you haven't read chapters 1 and 2, you'll go to our website and you'll see some of the previous things that we've been doing. And they told me I had 10 minutes, so I probably have a half hour worth of material to cover in 10 minutes. So I'm gonna go really quick. So so Tedson already kind of covered this, so you know who I am. But this is our mission: to understand, enhance, and enact human imagination. And a lot of this is further delineated in here, so I'll give you the highlights and let you dig in here for some further things. So if that's our mission, to understand, enhance, and enact human imagination, I guess one of the first things we have to do is ask this question about what is imagination. And I'll point you to a lecture you can find on our website where I kind of go through that in a lot more depth. But that's one of the primary questions that we have to ask in the center. And if we ask that, then we also want to think about how we might intervene with it. So I would characterize that there's at least 3 axes to this human imagination. There's an axis that's more spatial, that moves from the neural to the cognitive to the social. There's one that's more temporal, that imagination allows us to go from one moment to the next. It allows us to then think about the near-term future, and then it allows us to think about the far future. And there's levels of ways it's implemented, from the personal to the local to the global to the social. So we develop research programs, public programs, and pedagogy that looks to understand imagination and how it's developed through various applications. And then if we start to gain some understanding, is there points at which we can start to engage with it to accelerate imaginative processes? So one thing we look at is a way in which to construct collaboration or symbiosis between these different levels of the systems of imagination. How we might utilize the methods of dynamic computational systems as a way to track these imaginative processes. And ultimately to engage users' behavioral state in more subtle and nuanced ways. So from tools such as data analytics to new types of human-computer interactions, brain control interfaces, and experiential environments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, give you some examples of how this works across some of these scales. So first, if we look at this, the neuronal basis of imagination, might we be able to discover and understand an aspect of that? So what is this biological basis of the imagination? Is there something at the neuron, what happens in neurons, that becomes the scaffolding of how we extend imagination to larger scale? So we're working with stem cell researchers, Alison Motry and Beatrice Freitas, on a project in which we look at a comparative way to study human imagination with Homo sapien imagination with humans whose imagination may have limitations. And so if we look at the Neanderthal artifact record, we see that over about 500,000 years, the cultural artifacts remain relatively constant. They reached a certain level of sophistication and then didn't proceed much further. When humans came on the scene, we have kind of overlap with the same kind of artifactual record, but in a very short time, we learn how to wax mustaches into funny shapes, and while we wear our Google glasses. So there's some difference about the way in which the human brain works in ways that are different from our very closest genetic relative. And so we have a way in which we can start to look at what those differences might be at the neuronal level. Using stem cells, we can actually grow Neanderthal neurons. We know the genome. We know the places that we can intervene, about 40 significant different gene differences, and we can grow Neanderthal neurons. And then we can test them. So we have a program in which we're developing and then testing neurons to see ways in which they might anticipate different kinds of electrical conditions. And so our hypothesis is that we know the morphological differences, and now we're looking for the functional differences between these neurons. So we also then start to think about working with the ways in which the brain itself uses imagination to construct our sense of the present. And so I would say what we think of as the present is the combination of sensory data, memories, and imagination. And between those two, we fuse them, and that tells us what this moment is right now. And the way that happens, one way that might be happening, is the ways in which different systems of our brain communicate with each other at varying frequency, allowing our brain to essentially multitask many different types of activity at a time. So we're looking at a way to kind of remove the sensory data part of that and look at how in which an aspect of latent information coming from that sensory data is actually a spark of imagination to correlate and integrate those other parts of the cognitive system. So those are a couple things where we're starting to look at kind of brain operation and neuronal operation itself. But now we're trying to look at other kinds of brain phenomena that might evoke, that we can invoke, where we might be able to measure components of imagination. And so one of them is around anticipation. And so there's a fairly well-known phenomena called the Uncanny Valley. And when our representations of the human become fairly close to the human, but not quite on spot, and it produces a really strong response. And so often people characterize the Uncanny Valley as something that they're trying to avoid when they make computer animation or robots. And a very famous example is the Polar Express movie, which captured Tom Hanks and repurposed him in a variety of ways, and it basically creeped people out. But creeping people out is something that artists have done for millennia. It's one of the things we do. We want to engage those really primal human emotions in the work that we create. So I say, well, if this Uncanny Valley phenomena exists, how do we start to utilize that in a more proactive way? And so the Uncanny Valley happens to actually produce different responses in the brain. So at the top slide, you see fMRI on the right, EEG in the middle, and the three targets it's responding to: a human, an android, and a robot that's really robot-like. It's not trying to be human. And between experiencing the human and the robot, our brain kind of responds in a very similar way. But when it reaches something, when it responds to something that's in that Uncanny Valley, our brain really fires up. So we get this neural signature of what's happening around this interaction. And so we're building a system where we use EEG to engage people's interaction with avatars and tweak the avatar experience just a little bit. And we're working with their eye engagement. This is the primary place that we focus on. And from that, developing a system where we can both train a system to be very responsive to an individual's own brain phenomena, but then utilize it as a way in which we can provoke and drive interactive experiences with avatars or with robots. So this kind of way in which we anticipate the world around us, the way that we imagine the kind of interactions we might have, there's also a way in which it really has a spatial navigation basis. So we have a project where we're working with a virtual reality system we're developing that's supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation and IBM, where we're creating a multi-user virtual world in which we, again, look at different brain responses to different navigational conditions. And the two conditions that we have are how we use different spatial models of an allocentric model versus an egocentric model to think about how we're going to engage in space. And go back one. And this again is a phenomena that we can actually see specific brain signatures from. But what's interesting is we actually switch we find that people have a primary way in which they do this, but they switch mental models. And the more effective you are at doing that, the more effective you are at spatial engagement. So we're creating virtual worlds in which we're coupling this bottom device here is this device that we're creating that uses EEG sensors on that back part of the brain with a Google Cardboard VR system. And here's just a little clip that comes out of that. And so what we're creating is this environment that uses a number of somewhat familiar but somewhat bizarre kind of elements related to spatial navigation. And to be successful in this environment, you both change the scale of the environment and change your own scale in relationship to the environment. So we're adding from the typical way in which you use XY navigation to using scale transformations as navigation. And so we have this infinitely scaling world that people are a part of. And they engage and start to get coherency from that by looking at the ways in which other people are also making decisions in that environment. So it uses both kind of a social cognition along with this spatial cognition. Now, so this idea about how imagination occurs in spatial cognition is kind of the next level up from this. And so we have a lab called the Imaginarium where we're developing methods by which we can capture and characterize social interaction. And this has immediate relevance to things like workspaces, learning environments, creative interactions, and brainstorming. So it has a kind of number of technical things that are a part of it to capture this. But then we've been applying it in different kinds of scenarios, like a Art of Science learning project that's an NSF-funded project, where groups of people come together and try to bring kind of artistic thinking to large-scale problems like water resource utilization, for instance, and build models in relationship to that. Or ongoing work with the choreographer, the British choreographer Wayne McGregor, who has been working with this system now for a couple of years and now uses it as an integral way in which they capture their own choreographic creative process as a method of feedback into the development of new dance performances, and just premiered a new one. And then we have a virtual world environment that we've created called Verbella that we've done in collaboration with the Rady School of Management at UC San Diego, and are now using it with our Clinical and Translational Research Institute. And what it allows us to do is create these virtual world multiplayer simulations that immerse people in complex engagements, multidisciplinary collaborations, how they might take projects and follow them down different kinds of paths. And what it allows us to do in the virtual world is capture all of their behavior between each other and between the kind of data corpus that they're interacting with it. And so that allows us to bring kind of data analytics both post hoc and also in real time to transform those relationships. And we've used it in a lot of different contexts with a global set of global business schools, with some companies, with the pharmacy school, and as an adjunct to a Coursera work. Now, but I think one place where we're going that's really quite exciting is imagining how we not only can collaborate with others, but how are we going to collaborate with our machines that we're inventing that will eventually take over for us. And so we better learn how to work well with them. So we have this artificial life environment called Assembly, and where people interact with it both through cell phones and through brain control interfaces. And so it creates 4 different levels that are kind of symbiotic, nested levels of artificial life simulations. And I'll show you just a little bit of someone interacting with it with a brain control interface. So the woman in the middle just shook her head. She's got a brain control interface on. And she's transforming the level of visuality that the environment has. And so here's a kid doing it. We'll just watch him do it for a few seconds. So if he has a greater capacity for taking in the environment, it shows him more complexity in the visualization.
That's sort of scary.
Yeah, so his brother thinks it's kind of scary. So those are some of the ways we're trying to look at ways that we can intervene in a more direct manner with the process of human imagination. And we also have this strong basis in science fiction as this field that stretches our imagination, that allows us to think about our current condition in ways that are expansive and insightful. So how do we bring this kind of science fictional lens to other areas of our cultural pursuits? So we did a workshop this year with the performance artist Marina Abramovic and the science fiction writer Stanley Robinson. So I don't know if you know Marina Abramovic's work, but she is all really about kind of the inner space. And Stan was writing this book about travel to a distant galaxy. So we had a workshop where I saw that there were these analogies between how we would travel through inner space to how we would travel through outer space. So we brought these two together and looked at ways we could tease out those analogies. It resulted in an installation that was at the Venice Biennale last year, and a film called 3015, and a podcast from Stan Robinson's newest book, Aurora. We also have a project that we've done with our freshman course called Are We Alone?, where we ask that question from every possible perspective, from the biological, from the social, from the anthropological to the cosmic. And so, are we alone as an individual? Well, I'm not alone up here. I'm up here with my billion other bacteria that are part of my human biome. I'm actually in the minority of DNA standing in front of you, to how we might actually think about how we are alone in the universe. And this is a project now that we're working with the Breakthrough Prize Foundation to create as a global online course. We started a new major. This was one of the things I wrote about in my proposal to the Clarke Foundation about speculative design. And in the time from the proposal till now, we're now launching this major on looking at how we can utilize design thinking to comprehensively look at how innovation shapes the future of the human condition. We're doing the medical device evaluations for the Tricorder X Prize. So Dr. Eric Vieri is leading that up, and here he is with Peter Diamandis and other Clarke Center faculty, where we're bringing in all the tricorders from all the different teams. We run the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop, and so every summer we bring in half a dozen of the most interesting science fiction writers and 30 of the most interesting aspiring science fiction authors. And great things have always come out of Clarion. We have a range of events that engage these interdisciplinary conversations. And we have a sci-fi flick series, of course. And with the flick series, we usually bring 3 people to talk about the film from its scientific perspective, its status as a cultural artifact, and its social impact. And had great people like Keir DeLay, Fred Ordway, Richard Dreyfuss. We have our annual program with the Smithsonian, The Future is Here, and the future will be here again this year, April 22nd, and probably leading up to April 22nd. There's a lot of future to live through as well. But mark April 22nd on your calendar. We're booting up an interesting one. We give grants to students, but I want to just spend my last few seconds talking about upcoming activities. So we have a big project that we're doing on human and machine imagination with Google and the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And so this will be late spring, early summer, an exhibition, a symposium, and a book. I mentioned the Are We Alone project that we're doing. We have a symposium and book project on transparency that we're doing with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. And the book for that is 90% done. And we're developing international affiliates. So University of Liverpool, Shanghai University, Aalto and Aalborg universities in Scandinavia. A new What is Imagination workshop with the Kavli Institute for Brain and Mind. We have a TV series we're trying to do that we need more support for. And a symposium this year on Octavia Butler. And then also probably something with the World Future Society's 50th anniversary next summer. We have a great external advisory committee of people from around the world. Somehow my internal advisory committee slide got skipped, but don't tell them. We have great people from around the campus, and it all is possible because people support us. So from Viasat, who's our founding partner, the Clarke Foundation, and we have some terrific Founders Orbit members, and I think at least one of them here, Ed Horowitz, who we think has been greatly supportive. As well as other companies like IBM and Genitar and some other foundations that are a part of this. So with that, the end of Chapter 3. Look forward to having you hear about Chapter 4 next year. Thanks.